Hello and welcome everyone, I'm your host, and we are now getting terrible scenes emerging out of southern Japan following that magnitude 7.1 earthquake that struck Kumamoto Prefecture. This isn't a story about a number on a screen anymore. This is rescue crews digging through a collapsed shopping mall with their hands. This is soldiers combing through flattened houses. This is a death toll that started at a handful and has been climbing hour by hour since. So let's get into it, boots on the ground style, and walk through exactly what we're seeing right now. First, the basic details, because you need the numbers before the footage makes sense. The Japan Meteorological Agency gave this a preliminary magnitude of 7.1, registering at the very top of their seismic intensity scale, Shindo 7, the highest classification they have. USGS, as usual, came in lower, revising their number down to a 6.8. I'm going to be referencing the Japanese number throughout this because, frankly, they have seismometers planted all over their own islands picking up this data in real time, while USGS is triangulating this from the other side of the planet. When the people who actually felt it and measured it directly say 7.1, I tend to trust that read. This was also a shallow earthquake, striking at a depth of just over 6 miles beneath the surface, which is exactly the kind of depth that produces maximum shaking at the surface. Shallow and strong is about the worst combination you can get for a populated area, and Kumamoto found that out today. The epicenter sat around 12 miles south of Kumamoto City itself, a city of roughly 700,000 people on the island of Kyushu, Japan's southernmost main island. It struck at 4:27 in the afternoon local time, so this hit in the middle of a normal weekday, people out shopping, kids finishing up school, workers on factory floors, which is part of why the human toll here is what it is. A tsunami advisory went out almost immediately for the Ariake and Yatsushiro seas, with officials warning of waves up to around a meter, a little over 3 feet. That advisory was lifted within a couple hours, once it was clear the wave activity wasn't materializing into anything catastrophic. But for those first tense hours, people up and down that coastline had to evacuate inland, not knowing whether this was going to turn into another 2011 situation. Now let's talk about what's actually on the ground right now, because this is where it gets genuinely hard to watch. The single worst scene to come out of this whole event is the Aeon Mall in Kashima Town. This is a massive shopping center, and according to the mall's own operator, there were something like 2,700 staff working that day, plus an unknown number of customers, since this hit right in the middle of summer vacation season, one of the busiest stretches of the year for a mall like this. Everyone made it out during the initial shaking, evacuated to the parking lot. Then, roughly 50 minutes later, there was an explosion inside the structure. The second floor came down. Ceiling panels caved in, metal debris scattered everywhere, and people who had gone back in, staff doing checks, some customers, some workers who hadn't fully cleared the building were caught in it. Rescue crews spent the night and into the next day pulling people out of that rubble. 8 people were physically extracted alive from the wreckage in the early hours, 5 of them injured, but multiple deaths were confirmed specifically tied to that mall. Explosion and collapse, and as of the latest briefing, a handful of workers were still unaccounted for. The mall's president stood up at a news conference, bowed deeply alongside 2 of his executives, and said publicly that they take it seriously that precious lives were lost. That's about as somber as a corporate statement gets, and it tells you how bad this scene actually is. It wasn't just the mall. A paper factory in Yatsushiro, the Nippon Paper Industries plant, had a chimney come down during the shaking, and that site alone accounted for a cluster of deaths and several more workers missing, with rescue teams working that location in parallel with the mall site. Between those 2 locations, you're looking at the overwhelming majority of the fatalities from this event. This is the story so often with these mid-size earthquakes. It's rarely the shaking itself that produces the highest toll. It's the secondary failures. Just like San Francisco in 1906, where it was really the fires that broke out afterward that did the worst of the damage rather than the shaking alone. Here you had an explosion at a mall that turned a survivable earthquake event into something with a real body count. As of the most recent count coming in, officials have confirmed at least 18 dead, and that number has been climbing steadily since the initial reports of 13 just hours earlier. At least 62 people are injured, 6 of them seriously, and prefectural officials themselves are saying they expect this tally to keep rising as search operations continue. That's the honest, sobering reality of these events. The first number you hear is never the final number. There's also at least 1 foreign national confirmed among the dead, which tends to widen how a story like this gets covered internationally. Let's talk about the wider destruction, because this wasn't contained to 1 mall and 1 factory. Kumamoto Castle, a historic landmark that's been rebuilt and reinforced since it took damage in the 2016 quake, sustained fresh damage to its stone walls. Shrines and temples across the region reported partial collapses. Residential streets are full of homes with cracked foundations, collapsed walls, roofs caved in. Roads across the region buckled and cracked open, and if you've seen any of the footage coming out, you'll notice these long fissures running straight through pavement. A very clear visual signature that you're looking at ground very close to the actual fault trace. A commuter train derailed at Yatsushiro Station. Bullet train and local rail service across Kyushu was suspended entirely for safety inspections. The runway at Aso Kumamoto Airport was closed with, according to their own notice, no timeline for reopening. Nearly 35,000 households remain without electricity as of the latest count, and something like 15,000 homes are without running water, which in the middle of a hot, sweltering summer is its own quiet crisis for rescue workers and residents alike, since heat exhaustion becomes a real risk for anyone still trapped or displaced. Japan's Nuclear Regulation Authority did put out an emergency statement confirming no abnormalities were detected at the 3 nearby nuclear facilities, Ikeda, Genkai, and Satsuma Sendai, which is the kind of check that happens automatically anytime there's a quake of this size in that part of the country, and it's a genuine relief that came back clean. The Defense Ministry dispatched aircraft to assess the damage from above, and troops have been brought in on the ground to assist with the search and rescue effort alongside civilian emergency crews. Now, here's something worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the piece of this story that should really be driving the coverage. This exact area, this exact general fault zone around Kumamoto, produced an almost identical sequence a decade ago, back in April of 2016. That sequence began with a foreshock, a magnitude 6.2, then a 6.0, and people thought that was the main event. It wasn't. Days later, a magnitude 7 struck the same zone, and that turned out to be the actual main shock. Combined, that sequence killed around 50 people, injured well over 2,000, and damaged or destroyed something like 12,000 homes. A bridge came down into a river. Kumamoto Castle took damage that took years to repair. If you lay that 2016 sequence over what happened today, the parallels are almost uncomfortable. Similar depth, similar location, similar fault mechanism, similar devastating impact on the same castle. What that tells seismologists is that this stretch of fault beneath Kyushu didn't fully release its built-up strain in 2016. Some of it stayed locked, kept accumulating tension for another 10 years, and let go. Again today. That's not a guess. That's how these strike-slip fault systems tend to behave when a rupture doesn't run the entire length of a fault segment in one go. It leaves unfinished business behind, and unfinished business on a fault eventually gets settled. And that raises the harder question hanging over Kyushu right now, whether this is the whole story or just the opening chapter. Japanese officials themselves aren't ruling out the possibility of another large earthquake in the days ahead. A JMA planning officer stood in front of cameras and told residents directly to be especially cautious over the next 2 to 3 days, specifically because a shallow quake like this one tends to trigger continued active seismicity in the surrounding area. That's about as clear a warning as an agency can give without triggering outright panic. Aftershocks have already been coming in steadily, and while none of them have approached the magnitude of the main event yet, that pattern is exactly what officials are watching for, because in a small percentage of cases, what looks like the main earthquake actually turns out to be a foreshock to something even larger, just like what happened in this same region back in 2016. It's also worth zooming out to the bigger picture of what Japan has been going through over the past several months, because today's quake did not happen in isolation. Going back to November of last year, Japan has been sitting through an unusually active stretch of seismicity. There was a significant magnitude event off the Senriku coast up north earlier this year, part of a sequence that itself followed hundreds of foreshocks stretching back to November. And underlying all of it is the shadow of the massive 8.8 magnitude megaquake that struck almost exactly a year ago, the strongest earthquake to hit the region since the catastrophic 2011 Tohoku disaster. An event of that scale doesn't just release energy and go quiet, it redistributes stress across neighboring fault systems for months and years afterward. And a lot of seismologists have been watching Japan closely since then, specifically because of how that kind of stress transfer tends to play out. Today's Kumamoto rupture, on the opposite end of the country from where that megaquake struck, may or may not be directly connected to that stress redistribution, but it's certainly consistent with a country sitting through a genuinely hyperactive seismic period. Let's walk through some of what's actually visible in the footage coming out of the region right now, because the scale of this is hard to convey with numbers alone. There's aerial footage of the Aeon Mall that shows the entire back structure blown outward, steel framework exposed, the kind of damage you'd expect from a real structural failure rather than simple earthquake shaking. There's footage from inside buildings during the shaking itself, people's phones capturing roughly 40 to 50 seconds of continuous violent motion, shelves emptying, ceiling tiles raining down, And you can hear how long that shaking actually lasted, which for a magnitude 7 event at shallow depth is entirely consistent with what the physics would predict. There's dashcam footage from vehicles on the road at the moment of the quake, water sloshing wildly in nearby containers and puddles, cars visibly swaying on their suspension. There's drone footage over the Kyushu Expressway showing sections that, while thankfully not fully collapsed, are damaged badly enough that they're no longer safe to drive on. There's footage of collapsed residential wall, fallen shop signs lying in the street, cracked building facades, and rescue teams in hard hats and masks working carefully through unstable rubble. Because, in a situation like the mall collapse, you cannot just start pulling debris out fast. You have to work methodically to avoid triggering a secondary collapse on top of people who might still be alive underneath it. One detail that stuck with a lot of people watching this unfold. A teacher at a tutoring center near the mall described keeping his students seated for several minutes after the initial shaking stopped, worried there might be a second, larger event coming, before finally evacuating them outside. About 20 minutes later, from where they were standing, they watched what looked like an explosion go off at the mall behind them. He said the kids didn't fully register what they were witnessing. Some of them were even laughing and chatting from the adrenaline, the way children sometimes process something frightening they don't yet have the framework to understand. He said afterward it was chilling to realize that if his class had let out even a little earlier, those same kids might have been walking right past that mall when it came down. That's the kind of near-miss story you hear over and over after an event like this. Ordinary decisions, timing that could have gone either way. And it's part of why these disasters hit communities as hard emotionally as they do physically. Let's talk about the ripple effects beyond the immediate disaster zone. Because a quake of this size in a country like Japan doesn't stay contained to just the affected region. Japan is one of the genuine load-bearing points of the global economy, and when a shock like this lands in the middle of an already fragile currency environment, it tends to compound existing pressure rather than exist in isolation. The yen has already been under strain, and a disruption of this scale, closed airports, suspended bullet train service, damaged infrastructure, and the government now needing to divert attention and resources toward domestic disaster response, tends to add uncertainty into markets that were already jumpy. It's the kind of event that doesn't show up as a headline economic indicator overnight, but tends to work its way into growth forecasts and investor sentiment over the following weeks, especially if the rebuilding costs climb the way they typically do after events like this. Now, I do want to spend a few minutes on something I've been tracking for a while now, and I'll be upfront that this next part is my own framework, not something you'll find endorsed by seismologists, so take it as commentary rather than established science. For months now, I've been flagging a specific window tied to lunar and planetary alignment as a period of elevated risk for major seismic events, and this earthquake landed almost exactly inside that window. We're sitting right on top of a full moon, which, in my view, tracks with the tidal stress cycle that does have a small but real, measurable relationship with earthquake timing statistically. That part is genuinely studied. Beyond that, though, I've also been watching a Jupiter-Pluto alignment moving into position this month. And in the symbolic framework I use, Jupiter amplifies whatever it touches, and Pluto is tied to the subterranean, to transformation, to power released suddenly from beneath the surface. Whether or not you put any stock in that kind of reading is entirely up to you. I'm not going to pretend it's a validated forecasting tool, but it's part of why I'd been telling this audience for weeks that we were heading into a period worth watching closely, and unfortunately, watching closely turned out to mean watching this. What actually matters more than any of that, from a hard science standpoint, is the fault mechanism itself, and the fact that this general region has now ruptured with near identical characteristics twice within a single decade. That's the piece worth genuinely paying attention to going forward, not the planetary geometry, the actual seismic history. A fault that ruptures a major segment once, doesn't fully relieve the strain, and comes back 10 years later to finish the job, is a fault that seismologists will be watching even more closely now for a third act, whether that's next month or another decade from now. That's the real evidence-based reason Kyushu's earthquake risk isn't going away just because this specific event is over. Let's talk briefly about tsunami risk, because that was a real and immediate fear in those first couple hours, given the shallow, largely strike-slip nature of the rupture and the fact that this quake struck fairly close to shore but generated primarily horizontal side-to-side motion along the fault rather than the kind of vertical seafloor displacement that produces major tsunami waves. The advisory that went out was precautionary rather than reflecting an active, unfolding wave event, and it was lifted within roughly 2 hours, once monitoring stations confirmed nothing significant was propagating. That's meaningfully different from the mechanism behind Japan's 2011 disaster, where a genuine megathrust rupture displaced an enormous volume of seafloor vertically and sent a wall of water toward the coast with little warning. Nothing about today's event carried that same signature, and officials were fairly quick to communicate that once the data came in, which likely prevented a secondary wave of panic on top of an already chaotic day. Let me also address something that always comes up whenever a quake like this hits Japan, because I know it's already flooding the comments. People immediately want to know if this raises the risk of something happening here at home on the other side of the Pacific. And I want to be careful and honest with you rather than just telling you what generates clicks. The short answer is not necessarily, not directly. Japan sits on its own complex intersection of plate boundaries, the Pacific Plate, the Philippine Sea Plate, and the Eurasian Plate all interacting in that part of the world. And while there is a genuine, well-documented energetic relationship across the broader Pacific Plate system, the kind of connection where a major rupture on one side of the ocean produces a measurable stress change on a fault thousands of miles away is subtle, indirect, and very difficult to use as a specific short-term forecasting tool. We haven't been seeing anywhere near the same buildup of seismicity along the west coast that Japan has been dealing with over these past 9 months. That doesn't mean nothing is happening here. There's always background activity worth watching. But there's no clean, direct signal right now saying that today's Kumamoto quake changes the calculus for California or anywhere else along the Pacific Rim. If anything shifts on that front, it'll show up first as its own independent buildup of local seismicity, not as some kind of automatic knock-on effect from Japan. I also want to touch on the human infrastructure side of this because it matters just as much as the geology. Japan is, without exaggeration, one of the best prepared nations on Earth for an event like this, and you can actually see that preparation reflected in the numbers even amid a genuine tragedy. This is a country with building codes engineered specifically for seismic resilience, decades of retrofitting programs for older structures, an extremely dense sensor network that gave residents several seconds of early warning before the worst shaking arrived, and a population that trains for these drills from childhood. That's precisely why. Even with a shallow magnitude 7.1 striking almost directly beneath a city of 700,000, you are not looking at a death toll in the thousands the way you might in a country without that same infrastructure and preparedness culture. Contrast that with what happened in Venezuela just about a month before this, where a similar magnitude event in a region without comparable building codes and disaster infrastructure produced a death, toll in the tens of thousands. The difference isn't the size of the earthquake. In some cases, it's almost identical. The difference is entirely about what's already in place before the ground starts shaking. That's worth remembering anytime you see a headline magnitude number and try to guess how bad the human cost will be, because the number alone tells you surprisingly little without knowing what kind of built environment it's striking. That said, I don't want to undersell how bad the mall explosion specifically was, because that's the part of this event that preparation alone couldn't fully prevent. Earthquake-resistant construction is designed to keep a building standing through shaking. It is not necessarily designed to contain a secondary explosion that occurs after the shaking has already stopped, once people believe the danger had passed and some had gone back inside. That's an entirely separate failure mode, and it's the kind of thing investigators will be looking into over the coming weeks, trying to determine exactly what triggered that blast, whether it was a gas line rupture, an electrical fault, or some other mechanical failure disturbed by the shaking and then ignited sometime later. Whatever the ultimate cause turns out to be, it's a sobering reminder that even in a country this well prepared, disasters still find the gaps. I want to run through a bit more of what we're seeing directly from the affected region, because the imagery really does tell the story better than I can describe it. There's footage of shrine structures with their supports knocked out from under them, timber pillars snapped at the base. There's footage from inside homes showing furniture thrown clear across rooms, kitchens with every cabinet emptied onto the floor. There's a particularly striking clip of a cat reacting to the initial compressional wave hitting the building seconds before the stronger shaking arrives. The kind of moment that's almost become a recurring signature of these live stream disasters, now that so many pets sit near cameras or smart devices that happen to be recording. There's also footage of a plume of smoke and what witnesses described as white haze rising from the mall site in the immediate aftermath of the explosion, visible from a considerable distance across the town, which is part of why the scale of that specific incident became clear to the wider public so quickly. People didn't need an official statement to know something catastrophic had just happened at that location. They could see it from their own windows. So where does this leave things right now? It leaves southern Japan in the middle of an active disaster response with a death toll that is still climbing and will likely continue climbing over the coming day as search crews finish clearing the mall site and the surrounding neighborhoods. It leaves roughly 300,000 people in Kumamoto Prefecture under evacuation instructions, sheltering in designated centers rather than their own homes, some of which may not be structurally safe to return to for weeks. It leaves infrastructure, rail lines, an airport, and expressway, all needing inspection and repair before life in the region can fully return to normal. And it leaves a fault system that has now demonstrated twice in 10 years that it's capable of producing a shallow, destructive, magnitude 7 class rupture directly beneath a populated city. The honest takeaway, without needing to reach for anything dramatic to make this story land, is that this was already dramatic enough on its own. A shallow strike-slip earthquake struck almost directly beneath a city of 700,000 people during a peak shopping period, triggered a secondary explosion at one of the busiest buildings in the region, and produced a death toll that is still being counted. Rescue crews are still working. Families are still waiting on word about missing relatives. And officials are telling residents plainly that the next 48 to 72 hours matter, that this isn't necessarily finished. That's the story right now, not a forecast, not a theory, just the reality on the ground in Kumamoto tonight. And it's the kind of story where the most useful thing any of us watching from outside can do is keep paying attention as the numbers get updated, because they will be updated, and stay ready to pass along real information rather than speculation, while search and rescue teams do the hardest part of this work. We'll keep tracking this as it develops, and our thoughts are with everyone in Kyushu tonight who is still waiting for news of someone they love.